Russia categorically failed to take Pokrovsk during the summer offensive. Frankly, it should have learned its lesson when the vital logistical hub held strong and all of the minor gains Russia made around the city started to be reversed. But of course, Vladimir Putin never learns lessons. Rather than withdrawing from Pokrovsk, he has ordered his depleted troops to continue their assaults. And in doing so, Putin is creating a bloodbath. Russia's last-ditch assault on Pokrovsk has walked straight into Ukraine's meat grinder, meaning more dead Russian soldiers and the continuation of a defensive strategy that has stopped Russia in its tracks. On September 30th, Euromaidan Press reported that Ukraine had spent the previous few days expanding its control in the Pokrovsk region by counterattacking in several key positions. The Ukrainian goal is simple. After unfortunately allowing Russia to occupy several small settlements around Pokrovsk that created the potential for encirclement, Ukraine is undoing the damage. And in doing so, Ukraine is cutting off the remaining Russian troops from reinforcements, creating pockets of soldiers that have no way to fight back and no means of escape. That's the most important part of the strategy for Ukraine. Throughout the summer, Russia's forces exhausted themselves by taking these small settlements. Depleted and waiting for reinforcements, they haven't been able to prevent Ukraine from encircling them, trapping them in regions they thought they'd successfully occupied. Russia is trying to send reinforcements, of course, but Ukraine's own encirclement strategy means that those reinforcements are doing little more than charging headlong into a meat grinder that chews them up and spits them out long before they get anywhere near the exhausted forces that Ukraine has trapped so successfully. The reinforcements are firmly in Ukraine's crossfire, Euromaidan Press reports. As for the trapped troops, they're running out of time. Much of the fighting focuses on Dobropillia, Euromaidan Press says. Though not as important as Pokrovsk, Dobropillia is a strategically important town because it provides access to a vital highway and ultimately would aid Russia in its main objective of taking Pokrovsk. However, September has been a bad month for Russia in Dobropillia. By September 12th, Al Jazeera was reporting that Russia was gunning for Dobropillia, but it was losing more ground than it was gaining. The outlet said that the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrskyi, had claimed that Russia has captured about 5.21 square miles in the region, only to lose 10 square miles it had previously occupied. That sort of ratio is unsustainable for Russia. It's also proof that the traps Ukraine is springing on Russia's forces in the region are working. By September 22nd, UKR Inform said that Russia was continuing to launch assaults in Dobropillia, but they were all collapsing. Ukraine's counteroffensives were taking their toll. Plus, the encirclement strategy was doing its job in terms of cutting off Russia's logistics and preventing reinforcements from making their way into the region. Viktor Trahubov, who is a spokesperson for the Dnipro Operational Strategic Group of Troops, outlined why Russia has started to fail in Dobropillia. They infiltrated in small groups through the first line of Ukrainian defense, and then combined these small groups with a larger group, occupied positions and tried to break through. They then tried to fortify what they had already captured and bring in reinforcements, Trahubov explained. At some point at this stage, they began to fail. Thanks to effective countermeasures, we began to strike them, which began to destroy their logistics, and they began to gradually lose their positions. This continues to this day. This statement highlights the strategy Russia used throughout the summer. Rather than relying on large, mechanized assault groups that attack in waves to wear Ukraine's defense is down, Russia is now sending small units to infiltrate. These units, which are often just a few dozen soldiers large, are supposed to create small gaps in Ukraine's defenses before converging into a larger force that can fortify and open up larger gaps for future assaults. Only that's not what's been happening. The small units manage to break through, only for Ukraine to close the gaps they create and trap them in the territory that they occupy. It's a brilliant form of counterattack, and it's going to force Putin and his cronies back to the drawing board if they're to have any chance of taking Dobropillia, never mind Pokrovsk. This brings us back to Euromaidan Press's September 30th report. The outlet says that Russia, growing increasingly desperate in Dobropillia, is clinging to the settlement that may allow it to turn the tide, Novotoretske. Only a few weeks ago, Russia held this settlement and was preparing to use it as a launch pad for a multi-angle assault on Pokrovsk. Ukraine reversed that situation with a counterattack. However, Novotoretske hasn't been fully liberated by Ukraine. It occupies what Euromaidan Press calls a grey zone, in which Ukraine controls a handful of houses in the settlement. The rest of the town is being patrolled by Ukraine's drones, which are seeking out and destroying any Russian troops they find. Still, this lack of total Ukrainian control has led Russia to believe there's a chance it could retake Novotoretske. But to do that, it needs to find a way to break through Ukraine's increasingly dense swarm of drones in the settlement. Getting the operators is Russia's only chance, but for that to happen, dozens, if not hundreds of soldiers will have to die. Putin is prepared to make that sacrifice. He has sent fresh reinforcements to Novotoretske to aid in the push. However, with so much to lose for what is a fairly small gain, the question has to be asked. Why is Russia trying to complete this desperate, last-gasp push. Simple, it's all about the encircled troops we mentioned earlier. Euromaidan Press says that recapturing Novotoretske is the only way Russia sees to potentially reconnect with the beleaguered soldiers that Ukraine has trapped throughout Dobropillia. Those soldiers are being assaulted whenever they're brave enough to raise their heads, leading them to do little more than hunkering down as they hope for reinforcements to arrive. On September 26, United 24 media reported on comments Syrski made that reveal how well Ukraine has pulled off this entrapment strategy and what it means for Russia's Pokrovsk-focused offensives. Syrski uses the example of a predicted Russian assault close to the Novotoretske river. Ukraine's response to that assault showcases what it's doing in Dobropillia and throughout the Pokrovsk region. Anticipating such a development, we redeployed a number of military units. The plan was to cut the enemy grouping along the barrier line, the Novotoretske river, Syrski said. Thus, the enemy units that had advanced in depth found themselves in a kind of bag. At the same time, we closed that line with actions by our air assault forces units on converging axes from the north and south. The enemy ended up trapped. Its destruction is now actually underway. That's Ukraine's counteroffensive strategy in a nutshell, and it's working like a charm in Dobropillia. To find out how well it's working, check out our video where we cover the cauldrons of Russian troops Ukraine has created in Dobropillia. There are multiple cauldrons, and all are cut off from one another and from any incoming reinforcements. This is the situation into which Russia is trying to send fresh troops to Novotoretske. However, those new Russian soldiers end up facing a terrifying reality check as they attempt their assaults. Ukraine expertly covers every potential approach to the trapped pockets of Russian soldiers. Drones patrol constantly, watching for any signs of Russian movement on these approaches. Russia's forces are being watched constantly. Ukraine knows where they are, and it knows what routes they will take, and it knows what routes they will have to take if they're to stand any chance of joining up with their comrades. As soon as any of the reinforcements are brave or stupid enough to attempt an advance, Ukraine is on them. Drones descend and those advancing soldiers get eliminated long before they make it to the combat lines Ukraine has created. As has so often been the case during the war, it's a meat grinder in action. Putin is stuck when it comes to the decisions he makes. Attempting to take Pokrovsk and Dobropillia has to happen. These are Putin's goals and he isn't going to stop pursuing them. However, Ukraine's entrapment strategy has been so well executed that Russia's approach of using smaller units just isn't working anymore. There are no more gaps to exploit, only approaches that Ukraine monitors and has turned into kill zones for Russia's forces. The pockets of troops near Novotoretske may be trapped, but it's the reinforcements sent to save them who are dying. The only progress Russia has been able to make is into a trench fortification close to Novotoretske. Even that offers little solace. Some of Russia's reinforcements may be able to make it to that trench, but from there, they have no options. The approaches to the pockets they're trying to reach are shut off, and there's no chance of escaping the trench without facing overwhelming Ukrainian drone strikes, Euromaidan Press reports. It may seem strange to talk about trenches in the context of a 21st century war. However, both Russia and Ukraine have been using them extensively when fortifying. Le Monde highlighted this back in September 2023, noting that trench warfare had made a comeback in the Ukraine war. It noted that Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, which ultimately ended in failure, made heavy use of trenches because the country was forced to rely on infantry to make territorial gains. The same goes for Russia, which has failed to establish aerial dominance and is thus using trenches to help its troops make creeping advances. The problem with this approach for both sides is the same problem that existed when trench warfare reached its apex during World War I. There is always a no-man's land between the two sides' trenches. During World War I, that region would be pelted regularly by artillery, making any charge across almost suicidal. In Ukraine, the artillery is still there, but the real danger outside those trenches is the hordes of drones that awaits anybody who climbs out. Those drones don't just occupy the no-man's zone, hunting down anybody they find, but they also launch direct attacks on the trenches themselves, the Atlantic Council said in July. Ukraine has amassed aerial and ground-based drones to assault the trenches, which only highlights how a handful of Russian troops making it to a trench near Novotoretske doesn't really mean anything when it comes to trying to reinforce the trapped pockets of troops. So the meat grinder is in place. Russia's last-gasp attack on Novotoretske isn't working. Instead, Russia's forces are coming up against hordes of drones that shred them to pieces long before they can reach their comrades. You could argue that this is something of a stalemate. However, it's a stalemate that works entirely in Ukraine's favor. Russia's reinforcements are kept at bay while the trapped soldiers are whittled away. Eventually, grey zones like Novotoretske will be fully liberated, and Russia will have lost even more territory than it previously gained. Worst of all, it will end up losing more soldiers in the process than had occupied that territory to begin with. Now that the situation is so dire for Russia in Dobropillia, the next question to ask is what comes next. This is an easy question to answer from a Russian perspective. As we explained earlier, Putin isn't going to withdraw his forces from the Pokrovsk region. Russia's leader wants that city, badly. Even when his troops are being pushed back, he's going to keep ordering assaults. The death and destruction caused by Ukraine's meat grinder will all be worth it to Putin if it means Russia eventually takes Pokrovsk. That city, Putin believes, is the key to taking the entire Donetsk region. Pokrovsk is just 20 kilometers, or about 12.4 miles, away from the Donetsk administrative border. That's enough for Putin, as reaching that border means that Russia essentially takes Donetsk. So Russia's assaults will keep coming, even though it has trapped troops and reinforcements dying in droves. It's Ukraine's response that will really determine what happens next in Dobropillia and, by extension, Pokrovsk. One thing that we know for sure is that Alexander Syrski is making it a point to spend a lot more time in the Pokrovsk and Dobropillia sectors. We saw that on September 12th when UNN reported that the Ukraine Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief had visited the sectors to discuss the operational situation and provide instructions for the troops stationed there. That visit appears to have revealed to Syrski that his presence in this region is vital, which is why he's going to take personal command of operations in Pokrovsk and Dobropillia. At least that's according to Euromaidan Press, which says he frequently gathers his corps commanders together to discuss and plan out the next steps, react to Russian movements, and ensure his forces on the ground have everything they need to accomplish their missions. Syrski isn't going to allow the same type of oversight in command that allowed Russia to make progress toward Pokrovsk during the early part of the summer offensive again. Now every Russian assault will be met with a response that cancels the assault out almost immediately. But beyond maintaining the new status quo in and around Dobropillia, Syrski and his commander corps have turned their attention to new counterattacks. Next on the agenda is the region of Volodymyrivka. The settlement itself is under Ukraine's control, and it has been for a while. On August 25th, the Institute for the Study of War mentioned Volodymyrivka in one of its daily campaign assessments. Ukraine seized the settlement the day prior, liberating it from Russian control in yet another of Ukraine's late August counterattacks in the Pokrovsk sector. That retake was part of Ukraine's efforts to prevent Russia from expanding the salient it had created in the Pokrovsk direction during August. It worked. The salient broke down, leading to yet more entrapment of Russian troops, and Volodymyrivka went from being another potential launch pad for a Pokrovsk assault into a base from which Ukraine could launch further counterattacks. That's precisely what Ukraine intends to do now it has Volodymyrivka under control. Under Syrski's command, Euromaidan Press reports, Ukraine will turn its attention to settlements near Volodymyrivka. The idea here is to create another impenetrable wall to prevent Russian reinforcements from reaching the pockets of trapped soldiers deeper in Dobropillia. Beyond creating this barrier, Ukraine also hopes to consolidate the grey zones, such as Novotoretske, so it can truly liberate these settlements. However, in addition to all of this, taking the area southwest of Volodymyrivka allows Ukraine to do something vital: take the high ground near Dobropillia. Euromaidan Press explains, stating, "If we look at the topographic map, we will see that by advancing to the southeast and strengthening their positions there, Ukrainians will effectively seize control of the entire high ground. In turn, this would secure the flank of their clearing operation making its way south and deny the Russians any chance to counterattack from above." So Ukraine is turning its brilliant defense into opportunities to counterattack and take territory. However, Syrski also recognizes that Ukraine's resurgent Pokrovsk-based forces have another challenge to overcome in the form of Russia's 155th Marine Brigade. That brigade, Euromaidan Press says, was responsible for the massacre in Bucha that claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people, many of whom were civilians, before Ukraine liberated the town at the end of March 2022. This is a notorious and some would say elite brigade of soldiers that is among Putin's favorites, and that brigade joins all of the rest of Russia's available Marines, including those in its 61st Naval Infantry Brigade. David Axe reported in his Trench Art column on September 27th. There are now 5 Marine units operating in the Pokrovsk and Dobropillia sectors, Axe says, so Ukraine has to create a strategy for dealing with them. Part of this strategy is already in place. The reinforcements Putin is trying to send to his trapped pockets of soldiers include Marines, so some of these elite soldiers are already being taken out. However, Putin will likely want to use the 155th Marine Brigade to take as much territory as possible. Ukraine can't allow that to happen, with Syrski now operating in the Pokrovsk and Dobropillia regions along with the Azov Corps that aided in the Pokrovsk counterattack seen in August. These Marines will likely end up being neutralized. Ukraine will be aided by the fact that the 155th Marine Brigade is a shadow of the version that wrought so much havoc in Bucha. The New Voice of Ukraine said in October 2024 that this brigade had lost 2,400 soldiers since the fall of 2022, amounting to about 80% of its total forces. Putin will have replenished the brigade with new soldiers, of course, but these new Marines are less experienced and perhaps less capable than the original butchers of Bucha. The 155th Marine Brigade is still dangerous. Its classification as one of Russia's elite brigades hasn't changed. However, its complexion is different, and that may make Ukraine's job of countering it just a little bit easier. So both sides have their strategies in play. Ukraine's strategy seems to be the better of the two. What this likely means is that more casualties lie in the future for Russia's forces. Ukraine's drone operators are working day and night to ensure the reinforcements Putin is sending to Pokrovsk get cut down, Euromaidan press reports. When Ukraine secures the high ground near Volodymyrivka, even more problems will emerge for the Russian reinforcements. Anyone who manages to make it through Ukraine's layer of drones will then face the prospect of being ambushed from up high by Ukrainian artillery and soldiers. The odds are that Ukraine's strategy will only add to a 2025 that has seen Russia lose a tremendous number of troops to the Ukraine war meat grinder. For some context, The Economist reported on July 9th that Russia had already suffered 31,000 casualties since its summer offensive began the previous May. That offensive is now over, and you can likely double that figure for the true cost of what attempting to take Pokrovsk was to Russia during the 4-month campaign. September wasn't any kinder to Russia, and now, as Putin orders yet more assaults against a Ukrainian defense that is even more prepared than it was at the beginning of summer, the story is unlikely to change. More Russian soldiers are heading to the meat grinder. Those stuck in the pockets have no hope because none of those soldiers are going to break Ukraine's lines. For Putin, what's happening in Pokrovsk runs counter to the narrative that he's sharing with Russia's people. Now Putin has a problem. The Russian propaganda machine has backstabbed Putin, as several pro-Kremlin voices are declaring that Russia has already lost the war. The narrative inside Russia is changing and Putin can't do a thing about it. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in Pokrovsk. And thank you as always for watching.